The wind, a constant companion, howled its ancient song around the isolated windmill, rattling the old timbers. Inside, I barely registered it, lost as I was in the sterile glow of my monitors. This place, miles from the nearest paved road, was my sanctuary, my fortress against the ceaseless chatter of a world uninterested in the whispers from beyond the void. Here, among the whirring servers and blinking lights, I, Reid Harding, pursued the most solitary of quests, listening. For years, my life had been a meticulous choreography of data streams and spectral analysis. My days bled into nights, marked only by the shifting hues of the sky visible through the narrow, dust-streaked windows of my converted observation chamber. My work, an esoteric branch of astrophysics, focused on anomalous signals, the universe's static, its forgotten echoes. Most of it was noise, beautiful in its complexity, but ultimately meaningless. Until now, it began subtly, a faint tremor in the data stream, a ghost in the machine. A persistent, almost impassably faint emission, initially dismissed by the automated filters as cosmic background radiation or terrestrial interference. But I had built those filters, knew their blind spots, and something about this particular signature pricked at a long-dormant instinct. My fingers, accustomed to the cool, worn keys of my console, danced across the interface, adjusting parameters, widening the bandwidth, stripping away layers of computational assumptions. The signal solidified on my primary display. A waveform, intricate and impossibly regular, bloomed into existence. It wasn't the chaotic burst of a pulsar, nor the rhythmic thrum of a distant binary system. This was something else entirely. It possessed a geometric purity that felt deliberate, like a carefully etched diagram, not a random act of celestial mechanics. My breath hitched. This wasn't merely unusual. It was a symphony composed outside the known scales of the cosmos. I leaned closer, my reflection a pale, focused specter in the glass. The air in the chamber, usually cool, felt suddenly charged. My gaze swept across the auxiliary screens, confirming the coordinates, cross-referencing the spectral analysis. The source was deep, unimaginably deep, nestled in a galactic void between two superclusters. A region of space so desolate, it was considered a cosmic wasteland. Yet from there, this thing was broadcasting. Days blurred into a single, continuous vigil. I subsisted on stale coffee and the sheer adrenaline of discovery. My meticulous nature, usually a slow, grinding engine of verification, now drove me with a frantic urgency. Every line of code, every calibration, every filter was re-examined. I ran simulations, fed the raw data into every known astrophysical model. Each time the results were the same: null. The signal defied classification. It was too stable, too precise, too old. The initial excitement, the thrill of stumbling upon something truly novel, began to curdle. My instruments, calibrated to the picosecond, told me the signal had been propagating for an epoch that dwarfed humanity's entire existence. Not just millions, but billions of years. It had traversed unimaginable distances, unperturbed, its integrity absolute. It was a message from the deep past, yet it resonated with an unnatural clarity, as if it had only just begun its journey. I found myself staring at the geometric patterns it formed on the screen, patterns that subtly shifted, folding in on themselves in ways that defied Euclidean understanding. My mind, trained in 3 dimensions, struggled to reconcile what I was seeing. It was like watching a shadow cast by an object existing in a dimension I couldn't perceive, its form twisting and coiling, hinting at impossible angles and curvatures. The unease began to settle in my bones. This wasn't a natural phenomenon. Natural phenomena decayed, warped, lost coherence over such vast timescales. This signal was pristine. It was an anomaly that screamed intelligent design, but of a kind so utterly alien, it triggered a primal fear. What kind of intelligence could endure for billions of years? What kind of entity could craft a message that marked the very laws of physics? A repeating motif, almost a signature. I fed it into an audio converter, a tool I rarely used, preferring the silent language of graphs and charts. A low hum filled the chamber, a sound so deep it vibrated in my chest cavity. It wasn't a chord, or a melody, or even a rhythm in any human sense. It was a sustained, resonant drone, utterly devoid of warmth or variation, yet possessing an unnerving complexity. It felt like the sound of something vast, ancient, and utterly indifferent. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for my logbook. My pen hovered over the crisp white page. Anomaly designated echo. I wrote, the word feeling inadequate, almost childish. The signal wasn't an echo. It was an utterance, and it was still broadcasting, its silent geometry twisting on my screens, patiently waiting for an answer from a universe that had just begun to listen. The sterile glow of the monitors had become my world, eclipsing the ancient timbers and the howling wind that ceaselessly circled the isolated windmill. Days bled into nights, marked only by the shifting hues of the data streams across my screens. The signal, that impassable, beautiful anomaly, was a siren song, pulling me deeper into its enigmatic embrace. I was no longer just an astrophysicist. I was an archaeologist of the void, sifting through cosmic dust for a forgotten truth. My fingers flew across the keyboard, a blur of motion as I threw every algorithm, every filter, every conventional parsing method I possessed at the incoming stream. I fed it into spectral analyzers, waveform decomposers, temporal correlators, the most powerful tools known to human science. Each attempt, however, yielded the same maddening result. Nothing. The data refused to coalesce into anything recognizable. It defied Fourier transforms, laughed at wavelet analysis, and crumbled statistical models into meaningless noise. It was a language without grammar, a song without rhythm, a structure without Euclidean geometry. The patterns shifted, folded in on themselves, and then unfolded into entirely new configurations that bore no relation to their previous state, yet somehow maintained an internal consistency that hinted at profound, if alien, logic. Frustration began to curdle in my gut. My jaw ached from clenching, my eyes burned from the endless glare. Coffee had long since ceased to have any effect beyond making my hands tremor. I neglected meals, my stomach a hollow echo, and sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. The signal was a jealous mistress, demanding my full attention, promising revelation if only I sacrificed a little more of myself, and I was willing to give it. I had to understand. This wasn't just an outlier, it was a fundamental challenge to everything I thought I knew about the universe. It started subtly. I paused, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, and strained my ears. The wind outside continued its mournful dirge, but the sound that almost sound was gone. Just the old timbers settling, I muttered, shaking my head and rubbing my temples. Too many hours, too much caffeine, too little sleep. My mind was playing tricks. I dove back into the data, constructing bespoke algorithms, trying to force a pattern where none seemed to exist. I manipulated the raw influx, stretching it, compressing it, remapping its parameters onto theoretical constructs that were barely stable. Nothing. The signal remained a chaotic symphony, yet I felt, with an increasing certainty, that it was not chaos. It was ordered, but by an order so alien, so fundamentally different that my instruments, and by extension my mind, simply couldn't grasp it. Hours later, as the first grey light of dawn painted the sky beyond the small window of the isolated windmill, I leaned back, defeated, running a hand through my disheveled hair. That's when I saw it. It was gone before I could properly turn my head. My breath caught. I spun in my chair, scanning the room. Definitely stress. I stood, stretching my stiff limbs, the joints popping like dry twigs. My eyes felt gritty, and a dull ache throbbed behind them. I needed to step away, clear my head. Yet, even as I walked towards the small kitchenette area, a sense of wrongness began to permeate the air within the isolated windmill. It wasn't a smell, or a sound, or even something I could see. It was a pervasive, almost palpable sensation, like the very fabric of the space around me had subtly shifted. I stopped, my hand on the cold metal of the coffee pot. It felt as if the isolated windmill, my sanctuary, was no longer quite itself. It was a familiar room, yes, but seen through a distorting lens, a slight, almost imperceptible misalignment of reality. My scientific mind, however, immediately dismissed it. Exhaustion, sensory deprivation. The mind, starved of external stimuli, begins to invent its own. I poured a fresh cup of coffee, the aroma momentarily grounding me. The signal continued its relentless broadcast on my screens, a silent, beckoning presence. Despite the mounting frustration, despite the nascent unease stirring in the periphery of my senses, the core of my being remained fixed on it. I wouldn't give up. I couldn't. This wasn't just data, it was a doorway, and I was determined to find the key no matter the cost. The signal, that impassable, beautiful anomaly was everything. It was the only thing. The first dream began as a subtle distortion. I was standing, I thought, but the floor beneath me curved upwards and inwards, like the inside of a sphere, yet I felt no gravity pulling me down. The walls, if they were walls, were made of light that bled into shadow in impassable gradients, hinting at dimensions my eyes couldn't resolve. Shapes shifted, not with movement, but with a fundamental change in their very nature. A cube would unfurl into something with too many sides, then fold back into a structure that defied 3 dimensions, a geometric impossibility that made my eyes ache even in sleep. I felt no fear, only a profound, unsettling curiosity. It was information, I knew, but information for which my brain lacked the necessary processing architecture. I woke with a gasp, my fingers tangled in the damp sheets of the cart I dragged near my workstation. The screens of my equipment hummed, casting their familiar, comforting light across the small space. For a moment, the dream dissolved, leaving only a residue of disorientation. Then I heard it, a faint murmur like sand sifting through a silent void, barely perceptible beneath the drone of the machines. It wasn't coming from the speakers connected to the signal receiver. It was internal, a whisper at the edge of my hearing, echoing the strange, shifting patterns from my dream. "Just fatigue," I muttered, rubbing my temples. My voice sounded rough, unused. How long had it been since I'd spoken aloud? I couldn't remember. I pushed myself up, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The isolated windmill had become my hermitage, my prison. I poured myself another mug of bitter, stale coffee, the cold metal of the mug a fleeting anchor in my blurring reality. They weren't words, not exactly, but a rhythm, a cadence, like a language stripped of its phonetics, leaving only the pure, abstract flow of meaning. My mind, ever the pattern seeker, latched onto it. I found myself humming along, unconsciously trying to mimic the inflections to find a key. The determination that had driven me for years, the relentless pursuit of knowledge, now felt like a desperate, almost manic obsession. The next dream was worse. I was no longer an observer. I was part of the geometry. My limbs stretched and contorted into impassable angles, my vision fragmented into a kaleidoscope of non-Euclidean planes. The sense of being torn, of my very essence being reshaped, was overwhelming. There were colors that burned with an inner light, hues I knew had no place in our visible spectrum. I felt myself dissolving, my identity fracturing under the weight of an alien logic. I woke up screaming, the sound tearing through the quiet of the windmill, leaving my throat raw. My hands trembled as I stared at the blinking cursors on my main monitor. The data streams flowed, serene and inscrutable. But now I saw them differently. The subtle fluctuations in the signal, the almost imperceptible shifts in its frequency, they weren't random. The signal wasn't just transmitting information, it was implanting it, directly. This wasn't a discovery, it was an invasion. My brain, my very thoughts were being subtly rewired. But my fingers hovered over the power buttons, paralyzed. It wasn't language, but it felt like communication. A communication that bypassed my conscious mind, embedding itself directly into the architecture of my being. I felt a growing compulsion to understand, to decipher. It was like trying to stop breathing. His eyes burned with an unsettling light, a desperate, feverish intensity. There was this what sanity looked like on the brink. I remembered the clear-headed, methodical astrophysicist I used to be. That man would have shut down everything, fled the isolated windmill, called for help. But that man felt impossibly distant, a ghost from a life that no longer felt like mine. And I was listening. I couldn't help but listen. The signal had found its conduit, more than I could have ever imagined. My fingers, numb from endless hours of precise input, danced over the keyboard, chasing a pattern that had been eluding me for weeks. It wasn't a frequency shift, nor a complex encryption. It was something far more fundamental, a structural anomaly woven into the very fabric of the data itself. I had been approaching it all wrong, trying to force it into existing frameworks, like attempting to map a sphere onto a flat plane without distortion. The signal resisted, marking my terrestrial assumptions. I needed a new lens, a different geometry. My eyes burned, but a strange clarity had begun to bloom in the exhaustion. I started to see connections not between data points, but between the relationships of the data points, their implied adjacencies, their non-sequential dependencies. It was like trying to understand a melody not by its notes, but by the silence between them, the way the air itself vibrated. Then, a flicker, not on the screen but in my mind. A sudden, terrifying insight. I wasn't looking for a message within the data. I was looking for the data as the message. The patterns weren't encoding information. They were the information, presented in a form that bypassed linear understanding. I adjusted the algorithms, reweighted the parameters, feeding the raw, unadulterated signal through a bespoke filter I'd been tinkering with, one designed to ignore every known physical constant. I was trying to make the software think in 4 dimensions, then 5, then more. The screen shimmered. Lines of code, previously a chaotic cascade of green and white, coalesced into something coherent, yet utterly alien. It wasn't a graph, not a diagram, not even a symbol I could recognize. It was a structure, a lattice of interconnected points, but the connections defied Euclidean space. They bent back on themselves, intersected without touching, implied distances that were simultaneously vast and infinitesimal. It was a concept, rendered visually, of a dimension that didn't just add another axis, but fundamentally rewrote the rules of proximity and extent. My breath hitched. It was a glimpse into a space where up and down were meaningless, where here and there could be the same point, depending on the path taken. This wasn't just a discovery, it was an unmaking. My mind, trained in the rigid laws of the cosmos, recoiled. This was an affront to everything I understood about reality, the sheer audacity of it, the cold, indifferent elegance of a universe that could simply be this way. I pushed back from the desk, my chair scraping against the rough floorboards. The sound seemed to stretch, echoing longer than it should in the confined space. My face was pale, eyes wide, but the image wasn't quite right. The angle of my jaw seemed to shift, elongating slightly, then compressing, as if viewed through an imperfect lens. I blinked, and it stabilized, but the impression lingered, a subtle wrongness. My gaze drifted to the ancient timbers of the windmill's interior. The massive central post, scarred and weathered by centuries, suddenly seemed too far away, then too close. The distance from my outstretched hand to its rough surface felt mutable, elastic. I reached out, my fingers stretching, and the post seemed to recede, then lurch forward, as if the air between us was thickening and thinning. My hand brushed against the cool wood, confirming its presence, but my perception screamed that the space had just been different. I stood, swaying slightly. The floorboards beneath my feet felt solid, yet the entire room seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting by imperceptible degrees. The window, a familiar rectangle offering a sliver of grey dawn, warped. Its frame, sturdy oak, appeared to ripple, the top edge bowing inward, then snapping back, almost too quickly for my eyes to follow. The glass pane itself seemed to pull, stretching the distant horizon line into a thin, impassable smear, then releasing it with a faint, silent shudder. My coffee mug, half empty on the desk, caught my attention. Its ceramic surface, usually smooth and predictable, now seemed to possess a subtle, almost imperceptible texture, like fine-grained sand that shifted under an invisible current. The handle, designed for the human grip, looked alien, its curves subtly off, as if it had been molded for a hand with a different number of digits, a different geometry of palm. This wasn't a trick of the light, or a hallucination born of exhaustion. The world around me, my isolated windmill, my sanctuary of reason, was subtly, horrifyingly, being rewritten. The breakthrough wasn't just a new understanding, it was an invasion. The signal hadn't just revealed an impassable concept, it had brought that impassibility into my very perception, stretching the confines of my reality like a thin membrane on the verge of tearing, changing. It was no longer just a pattern, It was a language, a series of complex, interweaving geometries that defied every known principle of physics. I'd seen it morph, shift, and reconfigure itself into structures that seemed to fold inward, consuming their own spatial dimensions. It was a glyph written in existence, and I, Reid Harding, was the only one who could read it. My reflection in the dark glass of the monitor showed a stranger, gaunt, eyes bloodshot, hair a wild tangle. I hadn't shaved in days. The smell of stale coffee and unwashed clothes hung heavy in the air, a testament to my tireless vigil. But what did a little physical discomfort matter when the universe was whispering secrets directly into my core? I had to share this. The implications were too profound for me to bear alone. I spent another 24 hours meticulously compiling my findings. Graphs twisted into impassable shapes, spectral analyses revealed frequencies that shouldn't exist, and the raw data, when projected into 3 dimensions, formed tessellations that defied Euclidean space. This wasn't just a new discovery. It was a fundamental shattering of reality. I crafted a presentation, concise and irrefutable, ready to blow the minds of my colleagues. I scheduled a video conference, feeling a tremor of excitement, a desperate hope that someone else would finally see. When the scheduled time arrived, the faces of my colleagues filled the screen. A senior researcher, his brow perpetually furrowed, and a junior analyst, always quick with a skeptical quip. The senior researcher started, "Reid, good to see I've been quiet." We were getting a little concerned. His tone was too gentle, too measured. It was the tone one used with a child who'd wandered off. "I have something critical." I cut in, ignoring his thinly veiled apprehension. "The signal isn't just an anomaly. It's a structured entity, a non-Euclidean construct communicating across vast distances. The patterns, they represent a geometry that doesn't conform to our universe. It's like trying to describe a sphere using only lines." I shared my screen, pulling up the most damning evidence. The senior researcher leaned closer, his expression shifting from concern to something approaching professional skepticism. The junior analyst, however, openly scoffed. "Reid, that's a beautiful visualization, truly, but it's just noise, or a sophisticated coding error. The parameters I'm using for my dimensional projections are unorthodox." Unorthodox. I felt a flush creep up my neck. They are the only parameters that reveal the true structure. Our current models are insufficient. They are based on a limited understanding of reality. The senior researcher cleared his throat. "Reid, we appreciate my dedication. We truly do. But these patterns, while fascinating, don't hold up under rigorous statistical analysis. We've run my raw data through several independent algorithms. It's consistent with complex, naturally occurring cosmic background radiation, or even instrument drift, given my isolated setup." Instrument drift. I pounded a fist on the desk, the monitor shaking. The isolated windmill groaned around me, as if echoing my frustration. "This equipment is cutting edge and naturally occurring. This thing is twisting space-time in the data. I've seen projections that show impassable angles, lines that converge without intersecting, surfaces that have no discernible inside or outside." The junior analyst sighed, a theatrical puff of air. "Reid, perhaps I've been working too hard. Long hours, isolation, it can play tricks on the mind." "Tricks?" My voice rose, raw with disbelief. "I think I'm imagining this. I'm showing empirical data. This isn't subjective interpretation. It's a direct observation of a reality that fundamentally breaks our understanding of physics." The senior researcher held up a hand. "Reid, we understand you're passionate. Take a few days. Step away from the screens. Get some rest. We'll revisit this next week with fresh eyes." He offered a weak, placating smile. The junior analyst just shook his head, a pitying look in his eyes. They disconnected. The screen went black, reflecting my distorted image back at me. They didn't see it. They couldn't, or worse, they wouldn't. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was alone in this. Profoundly, terrifyingly alone. My gaze drifted back to the inactive monitors, then to the ancient wooden beams of the isolated windmill. The wind outside picked up, howling around the stone base, rattling the old sails. Was it just the wind? A prickle crawled up my spine. The way the junior analyst had sighed, so dismissive. The senior researcher's overly gentle tone. It wasn't just skepticism, it felt orchestrated, as if their inability to perceive the truth wasn't a failure of their own intellect, but an external influence. A subtle nudge. I spun around, scanning the room. The old gears on the central shaft, usually inert, seemed to shimmer in my peripheral vision, their complex teeth momentarily forming impassable geometric patterns. The signal. It was here. It was in the isolated windmill. It was watching. And it was already working its insidious influence, twisting the minds of others to discredit me, to ensure I remained isolated, a lone prophet of an unthinkable truth. Every creak of the ancient timbers, every gust of wind against the glass, sounded like a confirmation. They hadn't dismissed me, they had been made to dismiss me, and I was next. The senior researcher's placating smile, the junior analyst's pity they clung to me, a phantom chill long after the screen went dark. Pity. They called it fatigue. I called it truth. My truth, meticulously extracted from the abyssal hum of deep space, now dismissed as a delusion. But I knew. Back in my apartment, which doubled as my personal nexus of screens and circuits, the air felt thick, heavy with unspoken things. I moved through the familiar space, a ghost in my own life, driven by a singular purpose, to find the proof they couldn't ignore. My coffee mug, usually on the desk beside the main console, sat on the bookshelf, nestled amongst physics texts I hadn't touched in years. A minor displacement, I told myself, a simple lapse of memory. My own doing. I picked it up, the ceramic cool against my fingers, and set it back. I sat at the console, the glowing monitors reflecting my tired, intense face. The raw signal data scrolled, an endless cascade of alien patterns. Hours bled into each other. The faint hum of the server racks was a constant companion, a mechanical heartbeat in the quiet apartment. I leaned back, stretching my neck stiff. A flicker caught my eye. The mug. It was back on the bookshelf. I hadn't moved it. I stared, prickle of unease snaking up my spine. Had I been so engrossed I'd forgotten moving it again? My mind, usually a fortress of logic, felt suddenly porous. I pushed myself up, walked to the bookshelf, and retrieved the mug once more. This time I placed it squarely in the center of my desk, right under the brightest monitor, an anchor in the shifting sands of my focus. I watched it. I stared at the screen, then at the mug, then at the screen. Minutes passed. The mug remained. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Sleep deprivation, that was it. My mind playing tricks. But then the room itself began to feel wrong. The distance from my desk to the kitchen seemed to stretch, the hallway elongating, the perspective subtly warping. I walked into the kitchen for a glass of water, and the refrigerator, an appliance I'd owned for a decade, seemed to stand at an impassable angle to the wall, its white enamel gleaming with an unfamiliar sheen. My heart, usually a steady drum, began to tap a more frantic rhythm. I needed to clear my head. I decided to walk through the apartment, touch familiar objects, re-establish my bearings. I approached the bathroom door, its paint chipped in a familiar spot. I reached for the handle, turned it, and pulled. My eyes struggled to adjust, then widened. I was staring out into a vast, empty field, the sky above a bruised purple. In the middle distance, stark against the horizon, stood an isolated windmill, its ancient sails motionless, skeletal against the fading light. The scent of wet earth and something metallic, something like old rust and ozone, filled my nostrils. This wasn't my apartment. This wasn't even my city. I recoiled, slamming the door shut. My breath hitched in my throat. I pressed my back against the solid wood, my fingers digging into the cool surface. My mind raced, desperate for an explanation. A hallucination, a dream. I tried the handle again, slowly, cautiously. I pulled the door open a crack. My bathroom, the familiar tiles, the chipped mirror, the faint smell of soap. My vision swam. I closed the door, then opened it again. Bathroom closed, opened, isolated windmill. A scream built in my chest, but I swallowed it down, forcing my gaze to the signal data scrolling on my monitors. The patterns, once abstract, now seemed to pulse, to resonate with the impossible shift I had just witnessed. The signal. It wasn't just influencing my perception, it was manipulating the very fabric of my immediate reality. My home, my sanctuary, was becoming a canvas for its non-Euclidean geometry, a personalized nightmare unfolding around me. I stumbled back from the door, my legs weak. The floorboards beneath my feet groaned, and for a terrifying instant, I felt them buckle, as if the apartment itself was drawing a breath, expanding and contracting. The walls seemed to ripple, the angles of the room no longer fixed, but fluid, menacing. My meticulously organized laboratory, once a beacon of order, was dissolving into a labyrinth of impassable spaces. My memories, too, felt like loose threads, tangling and fraying. Had I eaten today? Was it morning or night? How long had I been trapped in this shifting prison? The determination that had fueled me now felt like a desperate, futile struggle against an entity that played with existence as a child plays with building blocks, casually deconstructing and reassembling the world around me. I was no longer a scientist observing an anomaly. I was the anomaly's playground, and the game had only just begun. Pity. The words scraped against my teeth, a dull, metallic taste. They called it fatigue, a convenient label for anything that defied their neatly packaged understanding. But I knew. The truth hummed, a low, abyssal chord from the deepest reaches of the void, and I had pulled it, thread by impassable thread, into the harsh glare of our limited perception. The isolated windmill stood sentinel against a bruised sky, its ancient timbers groaning under the constant assault of the coastal wind. I'd chosen it for its utter remoteness, a place where the static of human noise wouldn't drown out the subtler, more profound whispers. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the boarded-up windows, miniature galaxies swirling in the gloom. My equipment, a haphazard sprawl of monitors and custom-built receivers, hummed softly, a counterpoint to the windmill's deeper exhalations. I stared at the primary screen, a raw data feed from the array. The usual patterns, the familiar cosmic background radiation, the distant pulsars, they were all there, but underneath, like a palimpsest, the impassable signature pulsed. It wasn't a signal in the conventional sense. It was a breach, a tear in the fabric of what we understood as reality. The corner of the room seemed to fold inward, an impassable angle blooming where two walls met. My breath hitched. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them. The corner was normal again, the light falling flatly. Just fatigue, I told myself, echoing the senior researcher's dismissive tone. I leaned closer to the screen, adjusting the filters. The signature flared, a cascade of colors that had no names, shifting through spectrums I didn't know existed. It wasn't just visual. A sound, or rather an impression of sound, began to resonate in my bones. It was a frequency too low to hear, yet too vast to ignore, like the slow grinding of continental plates or the expansion of the universe itself, made audible. It carried no melody, no rhythm, only an insistent, all-encompassing pressure that seemed to flatten the air in my lungs. The space around me began to warp. The wooden floorboards, worn smooth by centuries of use, appeared to curve upwards towards the ceiling, then flatten again. The single, bare bulb hanging above me elongated, its light stretching into a smear, then snapping back into a point. My hands, resting on the console, felt alien, the skin crawling with a texture that wasn't my own. I tried to focus, to ground myself in the familiar, but the familiar was dissolving. This wasn't an illusion. This was real. My mind, for all its training in logic and empirical data, struggled to reconcile the input. My eyes saw the windmill, the familiar grains of wood, the rusty bolts holding the ancient machinery. But my deeper perception, the part that had been slowly unlaced by the deep space data, registered something else entirely. The geometry of the room was a suggestion, a fragile veil over a deeper, more fundamental structure that defied Euclidean principles. Corners had too many angles, distances stretched and contracted without moving. A wave of profound, ancient awareness washed over me, not a voice, not a thought, but a sheer, unburdened presence. It was neither benevolent nor malevolent. It simply was, like a mountain range, or the crushing pressure at the bottom of the deepest ocean trench, indifferent, immense, utterly beyond human comprehension. It had no face, no form, yet I felt its vastness, a consciousness so old it predated stars, so immense it dwarfed galaxies. This was no alien invasion. This was no malevolent force seeking conquest. This entity, this thing, was simply here, always had been. We, humanity, were the anomalies, the fleeting disturbances on its periphery, like dust motes in its colossal, ancient breath. It wasn't stirring to do anything. It was simply stirring. And our perception, our fragile reality, was unraveling because it was beginning to perceive us. The air grew heavy, thick with the unnameable colors and the bone-vibrating resonance. My skin prickled, every nerve ending screaming a silent alarm. I felt a subtle, almost imperceptible pressure on my skull, as if an immense, unseen hand were gently reshaping my thoughts, redrawing the boundaries of my very being. What I had glimpsed on my screens, what they had dismissed as noise, was not a message. It was a reflection, a shadow cast by something so fundamental, so inherent to the universe, that our own existence was but a ripple on its surface. The windmill's timbers groaned, a sound that seemed to echo the impassable frequencies now vibrating through my body. I was not alone. I had never been alone. We were simply too small, too deaf, too blind to know it. Until now. And the knowing, I realized, was the true horror, pity. I knew the truth hummed, a low, abyssal chord from the deepest reaches of the void, and I had pulled it, thread by impassable thread, until it began to unravel me. The isolated windmill stood sentinel against a sky the color of bruised plums, its ancient timbers groaning like the bones of a dying giant. The wind, a constant, abrasive whisper, tore through the landscape, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, a metallic tang that had nothing to do with rain. My skin felt raw against the rough wool of my jacket, each gust a physical blow that vibrated deep within my marrow. My limbs felt wrong, not just tired, not just heavy. They felt other, as if the familiar architecture of bone and muscle had been subtly rearranged, stretched into geometries my mind couldn't quite reconcile with human form. When I raised a hand, the movement felt alien, a puppet's jerk, and the sight of my fingers, long and pale, seemed to distort at the edges of my vision, blurring into something less distinct, more permeable. The signal, my constant companion, was no longer just a hum in the back of my mind. It was a symphony of discordant frequencies that now played across all my senses. The creak of the windmill sails was a sharp, green taste on my tongue. My eyes, once so precise, now registered the world in a terrifying blend. Sound looked like jagged shards of obsidian. The faint, earthy smell of the ground was a throbbing pressure behind my eyes. I knew with a certainty that was both devastating and exhilarating that this wasn't just data. This wasn't just information. It was an ingress, a doorway. And I, Reid Harding, had not merely opened it, I had invited it in. The entity was not external, it was becoming internal. My very cells, I imagined, were vibrating to its impassable frequency, aligning themselves to a new, non-Euclidean paradigm. My bones felt like they were trying to shift, to articulate themselves in a way no human skeleton ever could, a subtle, grinding pressure beneath my skin. My skin itself felt less like a boundary and more like a membrane, porous and thin, barely holding in the churning chaos within. The horrifying clarity struck me then, a bolt of pure, annihilating understanding that ripped through the last vestiges of my scientific detachment. It wasn't information to be understood in the conventional sense. It was a solvent, a corrosive agent. Its acquisition did not expand consciousness, it dissolved it. It did not reveal the universe, it unmade the observer. My identity, my very self, was not being enlightened. It was being overwritten, replaced by something vast, indifferent, and utterly alien. This wasn't a path to godhood. It was a descent into a formless, nameless oblivion, a transition from Reid Harding into a resonance, a memory of a thought. I stumbled back from the windmill, my legs feeling like columns of water, disconnected from my will. The world spun, a vortex of green sounds and metallic tastes. This was the price. The absolute, undeniable price. Every fragment of data, every impassable pattern I had deciphered, was a piece of my own being sacrificed, a brick removed from the foundation of my reality. My mind, once a fortress of logic and reason, was now a fractured pane through which I saw not the truth, but the terrifying process of my own dissolution. A desperate, primal urge surged through me, to resist, to understand. Even now, even as the edges of my vision bled into a shimmering haze, Even as the familiar contours of my thoughts stretched thin and broke, I clung to the scientist within. I tried to articulate it, to name it, to grasp the tendrils of my own unraveling and pull them back into a coherent form. "It's not knowledge," I rasped, the words feeling thick and clumsy on a tongue that seemed to have forgotten its shape. "Being." I tried to focus, to force my eyes to see the windmill, the horizon, anything concrete. But the world was shifting, the very air seeming to ripple with unseen energies. My reflection, caught for a moment in a dew-slicked pane of glass on the windmill's lower window, was a distorted smear, a face that was almost mine, but not quite. A strange, almost imperceptible pulsation began in my chest, a rhythm that was not a heartbeat, but something far older, far more expansive. My fingers twitched, yearning for a pen, for paper, for any means to record this final, terrifying observation. But what would I write? How could I explain that the universe was not a thing to be observed, but a process to be experienced, and that the ultimate experience was to cease to be? The wind howled around the isolated windmill, a mournful dirge. Or was it simply the sound of my own internal landscape collapsing? My thoughts were no longer linear. They branched, fractured, reformed in impassable geometries, chasing patterns that shimmered just beyond my grasp. I was a vessel, and the contents were overflowing, eroding the very walls that contained them. The truth wasn't out there. It was here, inside me, consuming me. And in the heart of that terrifying consumption, there was a strange, serene acceptance blooming, a terrifying peace that came with the final surrender. The cost of knowledge, I realized, was simply everything.